The air at the Henderson County Equipment Auction was thick with the ghosts of failed farms. It was a smell you never got used to, a greasy mix of old diesel, desperation, and the cheap sugary coffee the church ladies sold from a folding table. It was the spring of 1973, and for most folks, the future looked as wide and golden as a ripe wheat field. For Frank Miller, it just looked like another day to be careful. He leaned against the rusty fender of his Ford F-250, a 68 with a 390 V8 that drank gas but always started. His hands, calloused and permanently stained with the black of hydraulic fluid, were tucked into the pockets of his worn denim jacket. He wasn't here for the big-ticket items. He was a scavenger, a connoisseur of the overlooked and the undervalued. He was looking for a set of cultivators for his old Farmall H, maybe a decent sickle bar mower if the price was right. Things you paid for with cash you had, not with a signature on a banknote. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Slim, was working the crowd up. His voice, amplified by a crackling speaker mounted on a pole, was a hypnotic rhythm of numbers and cajoling. All eyes were on the main event, a brand-new, gleaming International Harvester 1466, fresh off the dealer lot. It had been part of an estate sale, the farmer having had a heart attack before he could even put 10 hours on the Hobbs meter. The tractor was a monster, a vision of the future with its enclosed cab, its turbocharged diesel engine, and tires that stood taller than a grown man. "Look at her, boys," Slim bellowed. 145 horsepower of pure American muscle. Got the air conditioning, got the radio. You won't even know you're working in this thing. Who'll start the bidding at $20,000? $20,000 for the Queen of the Corn Belt. A hush fell over the crowd of flannel-clad farmers. $20,000 was more than most of their houses were worth. It was a staggering sum, a gamble on the future, on prices staying high and the rain falling just right. Then a confident voice cut through the silence. 15,000. Every head turned. It was Dale Peterson. Of course it was. Dale was everything Frank was not. He was 10 years younger, with a smile as bright and phony as a new hubcap. He farmed the section next to Frank, land his father had bought and leveraged to the hilt. Dale believed in the gospel of modern farming. Bigger, faster, newer. He drove a new Lincoln Continental to town, and his wife never had a chip in her nail polish. Slim's face lit up. 15,000 from Mr. Peterson. Now we're talking. Do I hear 16? 16,000. Frank just shook his head and took a slow sip of his coffee. He knew the guts of his own tractor, a John Deere 4020 he'd bought used a decade ago. He knew the particular whine of its synchro-range transmission, the exact feel of the clutch when it was properly adjusted. He'd rebuilt the diesel engine himself one winter, honing the cylinders and plastic-gauging the bearings until they were perfect. That 4020 didn't have air conditioning, and the radio was a transistor he hung from the steering column, but it was his. Every bolt, every gasket, paid for. He owed no man a dime on it. The bidding for the 1466 climbed, a frantic back and forth between Dale and a farmer from the next county. But the other farmer was cautious, his bids coming slower, his brow furrowed with calculation. Dale, on the other hand, was all swagger. He'd just wave a dismissive hand, raising the bid by another $500 without even looking at his competition. The banker, Mr. Henderson, stood near the back, a pleased little smile on his face. He was Dale's banker, and everyone knew it. Finally, the other farmer shook his head and stepped back. "Sold," Slim shouted, slamming his gavel down on the lectern. "To Dale Peterson for $22,500. A wave of murmurs went through the crowd. Some were impressed, others were jealous. A few of the older men who'd survived the 30s, just stared at the ground and shook their heads slowly. Dale walked up to the tractor, a conquering hero, and swung himself up into the pristine cab. He fired it up, and the turbocharged diesel roared to life, a sound completely different from the old two-cylinder poppers and naturally aspirated engines most of them were used to. It was a powerful, aggressive sound. Dale gave the crowd a big wave, his smile stretching from ear to ear. As he was climbing down, he spotted Frank by his old truck. He sauntered over, his new boots crunching on the gravel. "Well, Miller," Dale said, his voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Still shopping in the bargain bin, I see. When are you going to retire that old museum piece of yours and get into the modern age?" Frank took another sip of coffee before answering, his eyes level. "She runs good, Dale, and she's paid for." Dale laughed, a short, sharp bark. "Paid for doesn't get the crop in the ground any faster. You can't make money by saving it. You gotta spend money to make money. It's the new way." He gestured back at the gleaming red tractor. "That's progress. You're standing still, which means you're going backwards." He clapped Frank on the shoulder, a gesture that was more of a shove than a friendly pat, and walked off to go sign the papers with the banker. Frank watched him go, then looked at his own gnarled hands. He thought about the hours he'd spent inside the engine of his 4020, the feel of the steel, the smell of the grease. He knew every weakness, every strength of that machine. It was an extension of himself. Dale didn't know the first thing about the engine in that 1466, other than where to put the fuel in. If it broke, he'd be on the phone to the dealer, waiting while his fields went unplanted. Frank stayed for another hour, long after the crowd had thinned. He picked up a solid two-bottom John Deere plow for $50 and a box of assorted hydraulic fittings for $10. As he loaded them into the bed of his Ford, he could still hear Dale's words echoing in his head. "You're going backwards." Maybe he was right. All around him, the world was changing. Farmers were taking on debt like never before, convinced by the government and the banks that the good times were here to stay. "Get big or get out" was the phrase on everyone's lips, a mantra preached by men in suits who'd never scooped manure in their lives. Frank's philosophy of owning what you run and running what you could fix was starting to feel like a forgotten language from a bygone era. Now, before we go any further, I have to ask you folks listening to this, who did you know like Frank? That quiet fella who could make a new part out of an old piece of scrap steel, the man whose toolbox held more wisdom than a library? Or were you surrounded by the Dales, the ones who chased the newest, the biggest, the shiniest, convinced that a bank loan was the same as a harvest? Let me know down in the comments. I'm truly curious to hear the stories of the men you knew. The breakdown came, as it always does, at the worst possible time. It was the first week of May, and the soil was perfect. The spring rains had passed, and the ground was just dry enough to crumble in your hand without being dusty. It was prime corn planting weather, a narrow window of opportunity that separated a good year from a bad one. Frank had been in the seat of the 4020 for 10 hours straight, pulling his 6-row planter across the North 80. The steady, reassuring rhythm of the diesel engine, a comforting drone. He was on his last pass of the day, the sun hanging low and orange in the western sky, when he felt it. A slight shudder, a hesitation in the tractor's powerful pull. It was almost imperceptible, something a less experienced operator might have dismissed as a tough patch of soil. But Frank knew his machine. He immediately throttled down, his ears straining. The engine note was off, a subtle miss, a cough where there should have been a clean roar. He pulled the tractor to a halt, the planter settling into the dark earth behind him. He set the brake, killed the engine, and sat for a moment in the sudden, ringing silence, listening. The only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the metallic ticking of the cooling engine manifold. He swung down from the operator's station, his boots sinking into the soft, tilled ground. He opened the side panel of the engine cowling. Nothing looked obviously wrong, no leaking fluids, no broken belts. He put a hand on the engine block. It was hot, but not unusually so. He checked the oil, the level was fine, but as he wiped the dipstick on his jeans, he saw it. A faint, silvery sheen in the black oil. His heart sank. It was the unmistakable glint of bearing material. Deep in the guts of his reliable engine, something was grinding itself to death. He spent the next hour in the fading light, trying to diagnose the problem, but he knew it was serious. It wasn't something he could fix in the field with a crescent wrench and a roll of electrical tape. He unhitched the planter, leaving it like a steel skeleton in the middle of the field, and limped the 4020 back to the farmstead, the engine making a sickening, intermittent knocking sound that grew louder with every revolution. Each knock was like a hammer blow to his chest. The next morning, the farm was quiet. Too quiet. The sound of a working tractor was the heartbeat of the place, and without it, an unnerving stillness settled over the barns and sheds. Frank had the 4020 in his workshop, a cavernous old building with a dirt floor and a single bare 100-watt bulb hanging from a rafter. He had the front end of the tractor split from the rear, the massive engine resting on a heavy-duty stand he'd built himself out of railroad ties and I-beams. For 3 days, he worked from sunup until long after midnight. This wasn't a simple repair, it was major surgery. He drained the oil and coolant, disconnected the fuel lines, the wiring harness, the throttle linkage. He methodically removed the radiator, the alternator, the water pump. Each part was cleaned in a pan of kerosene and laid out in order on a wooden bench. His hands, already calloused, were soon covered in a dozen new cuts and scrapes from wrestling with stubborn, rusted bolts. The smell of penetrating oil and old diesel hung heavy in the air. He found the culprit on the 3rd day. After pulling the head and the oil pan, he began removing the connecting rod caps. The bearing on the number 4 cylinder was completely shot. It hadn't just worn out, it had spun in the connecting rod, scoring the crankshaft journal with deep, ugly grooves. The crankshaft was ruined. Frank stood there, staring at the mangled steel, a wave of cold dread washing over him. A new crankshaft was a fortune, and it would take the dealer weeks to get one. Weeks he didn't have. His corn, his entire year's income, was still sitting in sacks in the barn. As if on cue, he heard the sound of a powerful engine coming down the road. He didn't have to look. He knew the sound of Dale Peterson's new 1466. A moment later, the big red tractor, pulling a planter twice the size of Frank's, appeared at the end of his lane. Dale slowed but didn't stop. He just leaned out of his air-conditioned cab, looked over at Frank's disassembled 4020, and gave a little shake of his head. He didn't even have the decency to hide his smirk. Then he throttled up, leaving Frank standing in a cloud of dust and the bitter smell of smugness. The encounter solidified a hard knot of resolve in Frank's gut. He wasn't going to the dealer, he wasn't going to the bank, he was going to fix this his own way. He spent the next day on the phone, the old black rotary phone in the kitchen. He called every salvage yard within a 200-mile radius. Most of them laughed when he asked for a crankshaft for a 4020. Those tractors were still the workhorses on half the farms in the state. Nobody junked them. Finally, a gruff voice on the other end of a crackling line from a place called Miller's Salvage in southern Iowa gave him a sliver of hope. "Got a 4020 in the back lot," the man said. "Threw a rod right through the side of the block. Total loss. But the crank might be good. Can't make any promises. You'd have to come pull it yourself." Frank didn't hesitate. "I'll be there tomorrow." He left before dawn, his old F-250 rattling down the gravel roads. The salvage yard was a graveyard of rusting iron, a sprawling testament to bad luck and broken dreams. Frank spent the entire day in the mud and weeds, lying on his back under the dead tractor, wrestling with the massive bolts of the oil pan and the main bearing caps. By late afternoon, covered from head to toe in grease and grime, he had it free. The crankshaft was heavy, an awkward, unwieldy piece of forged steel. He inspected the journals. They were smooth, within tolerance. It was a good one. He paid the man $200 cash, a fraction of what a new one would have cost, and wrestled the thing into the bed of his truck. The work back in his own shop was even more grueling. He had to mic the journals on the salvaged crank, order new bearings, and then painstakingly reassemble the entire engine. It was a slow, meticulous process. He checked and double-checked the torque on every bolt, cleaned every surface until it was spotless, primed the oil pump by hand. His wife, Mary, would bring him meals on a tray, her face a mixture of worry and unwavering faith. She never once questioned him, never once suggested he just call the dealer. She knew him. A week after the breakdown, while Dale Peterson was already finishing his planting, Frank was finally ready to put the two halves of the tractor back together. He used 2 chain hoists and a collection of floor jacks, inching the massive engine and front-end assembly back toward the transmission housing. It was a dangerous, nerve-wracking process. One slip, and thousands of pounds of iron could come crashing down. Finally, with a soft thud, the two halves mated, the bolt holes lined up. 2 days later, after reconnecting everything and filling the fluids, the moment of truth arrived. He climbed into the seat, took a deep breath, and turned the key. The starter groaned, turning the newly assembled engine over, once, twice. On the 3rd revolution, it caught, sputtering at first, then catching, then roaring to life with a plume of white smoke from the exhaust stack. Frank let it idle for 20 minutes, his eyes glued to the oil pressure gauge. The needle was steady, right where it should be. The knock was gone. The engine sounded strong, healthy, reborn. A slow smile spread across his face. He had done it. He had faced disaster and beaten it with his own 2 hands, without borrowing a single penny. He was 2 weeks behind schedule, but he hadn't been defeated. The rest of the 1970s seemed to prove Dale Peterson right. The world, it turned out, was hungry. A massive grain deal with the Soviet Union in '72 sent commodity prices into the stratosphere. Corn, which had hovered around $1 a bushel for years, suddenly shot up to $2, then $3. Soybeans were even better. For the first time in a generation, it felt like you couldn't lose money farming. The banks, flush with cash from petrodollars, were practically begging farmers to take out loans. The phrase "fence row to fence row" became a national policy, and the rush to expand was on. Dale Peterson rode that wave like a champion surfer. The profits from his first big crop with the 1466 were staggering, but instead of paying down his debt, he went back to the bank. Mr. Henderson greeted him like a king. Dale used his newfound equity to buy the 80 acres that bordered Frank's place to the south, land that old man Hemlock had been farming his whole life before he finally retired. Dale didn't even haggle on the price. Then he traded in the 1466, which was barely 3 years old, for a brand-new International Harvester 4366, a massive 4-wheel drive articulated tractor. It was a beast of a machine with dual wheels on all 4 corners and an engine that sounded like a freight train. It made his old tractor look like a garden toy. He followed that up by purchasing a brand-new Gleaner N6 combine, a rotary machine that could chew through 8 rows of corn at a time. It was the biggest, most advanced piece of harvesting equipment in the entire county. Dale's operation became a showcase of modern, high-tech agriculture. His fields were planted faster, sprayed more efficiently, and harvested quicker than anyone else's. At the coffee shop in town, the other farmers spoke of him with a mixture of awe and envy. He was the future. Frank, on the other hand, was seen as a relic. He had good years, too. The high grain prices meant that even with his smaller acreage and older equipment, he was making more money than he ever had. But his response was radically different from Dale's. The first thing he did was walk into the bank and write a check that paid off the last 5 years of his farm's original mortgage. He was 41 years old, and for the first time in his life, he owned his land free and clear. The feeling was more satisfying than any new piece of equipment could ever be. He didn't expand. He didn't borrow. He invested in the land he already had. He spent a summer tiling the low-lying 40 acres near the creek, a back-breaking job of laying thousands of feet of drainage pipe by hand with a rented trencher. It was a long-term investment that would pay dividends in wet years for decades to come. He used his profits to build a new machine shed, a solid pole barn with a concrete floor, so he could finally work on his equipment out of the mud and snow. He paid for the materials and the concrete in cash. He and a neighbor put it up themselves. And he continued to be a scavenger. He found a John Deere 7700 combine from the late 60s at an auction. It was old, but it had been well maintained. He paid a fair price for it, brought it home, and spent the winter tearing it down and rebuilding it. He replaced bearings, chains, and belts, hard-surfaced the augers, and fine-tuned the engine. By the time he was done, the old machine ran as well as a new one, and he owed nothing on it. The community watched his slow, methodical progress with a kind of pitying confusion. They saw Dale driving his new Lincoln, buying a boat for the lake, taking his family on a vacation to Florida. They saw Frank in his old Ford truck, his hands still black with grease, spending his weekends rewiring an old grain auger. The whispers at the co-op grew louder. "Frank's afraid," they'd say. "He doesn't have the stomach for the new way of farming. He's going to get left behind." Dale himself took to calling Frank Old Man Miller, even though there was barely a decade between them. The nickname stuck. One crisp autumn afternoon, Frank was at the bank depositing a check from the grain elevator. He had just finished his harvest, and the bins were full. It had been another good year. As the teller stamped his deposit slip, the bank manager, Mr. Henderson, came out of his office. "Frank, good to see you," Henderson said, his smile a little too wide. "Heard you had a good harvest." "Can't complain," Frank said simply. "Listen, I was just looking at your account. Henderson continued, lowering his voice conspiratorially. You're in a fantastic position, debt-free, money in the bank. Have you thought about leveraging that? The Hemlock Place is for sale, the 80 acres just west of you. With prices like these, you could pay it off in 5 years. We could draw up the papers this afternoon. The prime rate is still only 8%. It's practically free money. Frank looked the banker in the eye. I've got all the land I can handle by myself, Mr. Henderson. I appreciate the offer, but I'm happy with where I'm at. Henderson's smile tightened. Frank, you have to think about the future. The economy is booming. Land values are only going to go up. This is the time to get big or get out. You don't want to get left holding the bag when the small guys get squeezed out. The only bag I'm worried about is the one the bank holds, Frank replied, his tone polite but firm. He folded his deposit slip, put it in his shirt pocket, and tipped his hat. Have a good day. As he walked out the door, he held it open for Dale Peterson, who was just walking in. Dale was laughing, clapping Henderson on the back like they were old friends. He was holding a folder full of papers. Dale, just the man I wanted to see. Henderson boomed, his good humor instantly restored. Got the paperwork right here for that new center pivot irrigation system. Just sign on the dotted line and we'll have you watering that new section by springtime. Frank didn't stay to listen. He walked out into the bright afternoon sun, a strange feeling of unease settling in his stomach. 8% interest. Henderson had called it practically free money, but Frank remembered his father talking about the Depression, about how quickly things could turn. He looked up at the sky. It was clear and blue, not a cloud in sight. But on the far-off horizon, almost too small to see, he could just make out the shape of a distant gathering storm. And he had a feeling he was one of the only ones watching it. The first sign of trouble wasn't a thunderclap, it was a whisper. It came over the radio in the summer of 1980, a dry, crackling announcement about a grain embargo against the Soviet Union. The reason was a world away, something about Afghanistan, but the effect landed squarely in Henderson County. The bottom fell out of the corn market overnight. Prices that had been a comfortable $3 a bushel plunged to $2.20, then $2, with no end in sight. At the coffee shop, the talk of expansion and new equipment died, replaced by nervous muttering and the frantic scratching of pencils on napkins as men recalculated their break-even points. For Frank, the news was a heavy blow, but not a fatal one. He had no debt, so the price drop was a cut to his income, not a threat to his existence. He tightened his belt, put off plans to re-roof the haymow, and kept working. For Dale Peterson, it was the first tremor in the foundation of his empire. His operating loans, his massive land and equipment payments had all been calculated on $3 corn. Suddenly, the math no longer worked. The weather, as if conspiring with the global markets, turned against them next. The spring of '81 was dry. The summer that followed was a scorcher. The sky remained a pale, unforgiving blue for weeks on end. The corn in the fields, usually shoulder-high by July, was stunted and yellowing. The leaves curled in on themselves during the day, a desperate attempt to conserve what little moisture remained. Dale's new center pivot irrigation system, the one he'd signed the papers for that day at the bank, became his obsession. It was a magnificent steel creature, a quarter-mile long, that crawled in a slow circle, drawing water from a deep well. To power the pump, he had a massive 6-cylinder Detroit diesel engine that sat roaring in a small shed near the pivot point. The noise was a constant throbbing declaration of war against the drought, and the cost was just as immense. It burned 50 gallons of diesel fuel every 10 hours, and with the price of fuel skyrocketing after the energy crisis, he was pumping liquid gold onto his fields. Frank watched the giant sprinkler crawl across Dale's land, a shimmering curtain of water hanging in the dry air. He had no such weapon. His defense against the drought was the tile he had laid years before. His tiled ground held the spring moisture longer, a hidden reservoir that kept his corn a shade greener than his neighbors. It wasn't a miracle, but it was something. It was the difference between a poor crop and no crop at all. The breaking point for Dale's machinery came during the harvest. The drought had weakened the corn stalks, making them brittle. His Gleaner N6, with its huge 8-row corn head, was moving fast, trying to get the diminished crop out of the field before a storm could flatten it. Frank was in his own field, chugging along with his old John Deere 7700, when he saw the big silver combine grind to a halt in a cloud of dust. He watched for an hour as Dale and a hired hand poked and prodded at the machine. Finally, Dale's pickup truck tore out of the field, fishtailing on the gravel as it sped toward town and the dealership. The combine sat silent and immobile for 3 days. The talk at the co-op was that a main electronic control module for the rotary separator had fried. It was a sealed unit, a black box of circuits and wires that no one knew how to fix. A new one had to be ordered from the factory in Independence, Missouri, and it cost $3,000. By the time the part arrived and the dealer's mechanic installed it, a vicious thunderstorm had swept through, flattening 20 acres of Dale's unharvested corn. Frank finished his own harvest a week later. His yields were down by a third, but it was a crop. He filled his bins, paid his property taxes, and had enough left over to see him through the winter. He heard that Dale, after paying for the fuel for his irrigation rig and the expensive combine repair, had barely broken even. The swagger was gone from Dale's walk. For the first time, Frank saw the flicker of fear in his neighbor's eyes. The cracks in the shiny new empire were beginning to show, spiderwebbing out from a foundation built on borrowed money and the dangerous assumption that the good times would last forever. The storm that Frank had seen gathering on the horizon finally broke in the winter of 1982. It wasn't a storm of wind and rain, but of numbers on paper that fell with the force of a tornado. In Washington, a man named Paul Volcker at the Federal Reserve, determined to slay the dragon of inflation, cranked interest rates to levels not seen since the Civil War. The prime rate, which had been a practically free 8% when Dale was signing his life away, soared to 15, then 18, then an unthinkable 21%. For farmers carrying heavy, adjustable-rate debt, it was a death sentence. The notices started appearing in the county paper, small print in the legal section that announced foreclosure auctions. First, it was the younger guys, the ones who had jumped in with both feet in the late 70s. Then the names became more familiar. Established families who had been on their land for generations, but had been tempted by the siren song of expansion. Every auction was a fresh tragedy, the community gathering in somber silence to watch a family's life work be sold off piece by piece to strangers. The greasy smell of desperation and cheap coffee was back in the air, thicker and more suffocating than ever before. Frank saw Mr. Henderson, the banker, at the post office one morning. The man's face was pale and drawn, the confident smile was gone, replaced by a permanent, worried frown. The banks were in trouble too, holding millions in bad agricultural loans. Henderson, who had once clapped Dale on the back and encouraged him to borrow more, now crossed the street to avoid making eye contact with the farmers he had helped lead to ruin. The final blow for Dale Peterson came on a cold, grey morning in March. Frank was in his workshop, grinding a new edge on his cultivator shovels, when he saw the county sheriff's car pull into Dale's driveway next door. A few minutes later, another man got out, dressed in a cheap suit. He walked to the front gate and hammered a wooden stake into the frozen ground. Attached to it was a bright red sign. Frank didn't need to read the words. He knew what it was. A notice of public auction. The bank had called Dale's notes. It was over. For the next month, a funereal quiet hung over the Peterson farm. The massive modern machinery sat idle in the sheds, silent monuments to a broken dream. Frank would see Dale walking the fence rows, his shoulders slumped, a man adrift on his own land. He looked 10 years older than he had at the auction where he'd bought the 1466. The bravado had been stripped away, leaving behind a raw, hollowed-out despair. Frank's own survival was a quiet, unglamorous affair. His lack of debt was his armor. While others were paying 20% interest, his only major expenses were fuel, seed, and fertilizer, which he had paid for with cash from the previous year's crop. He wasn't thriving, he was weathering the storm. He fixed his own machinery, pulling parts from a small stockpile of identical tractors and combines he'd bought for scrap at other farm auctions. His neighbors, struggling to make repairs, started coming to him. "Heard you might have a water pump for a 40/20, they'd ask, hat in hand. Frank never charged them more than what the part was worth, And if they were short on cash, he'd trade for a few hours of help baling hay or a side of beef for the freezer. His workshop became an informal hub, a place where old iron and older values were keeping a handful of farms alive. He realized the true, stark difference between his situation and Dale's one afternoon when he needed a specific hydraulic fitting. He drove into town to the implement dealer. The parts counter, usually a busy, cheerful place, was deserted. The parts man, a fellow Frank had known for 20 years, looked exhausted. "Can't help you, Frank," he said, shaking his head. "Corporate put a freeze on all but the most essential inventory, and everything is cash on the barrelhead now. No credit, not even for old customers." On his way out, Frank saw the dealer's mechanic trying to diagnose a problem on a huge late-model tractor, almost identical to Dale's articulated 4366. The mechanic had a complex-looking electronic diagnostic tool plugged into a port under the dashboard, and he was staring at the readout with a look of complete bewilderment. "What's wrong with it?" Frank asked. "Heck if I know," the mechanic grumbled, wiping sweat from his brow. "The computer says the transmission hydraulic pressure sensor is faulty, but I replaced the sensor and it's still giving the same code. The wiring harness checks out. The regional tech support guy thinks it might be the main controller, but that's a $5,000 part, and we can't return it if that's not the problem. The owner's been down for a week, right in the middle of planting." Frank nodded, a cold understanding settling over him. He thought of his 4020. Its transmission was a masterpiece of mechanical simplicity: gears, shafts, and bearings. If something went wrong, you could hear it, feel it. You could take it apart with wrenches and see the problem with your own eyes. There was no computer to lie to you. He drove home, the $10 fitting he'd salvaged from a junked planter rattling on the seat beside him. He passed Dale's farm, the red auction sign a stark wound against the landscape. He saw now that Dale hadn't just bet on high grain prices. He had bet on a system of complexity and dependency. He had traded the resilience of steel and grease for the fragility of circuit boards and credit. And when the system broke, it took him down with it. Frank, with his museum of old iron and his deep-seated aversion to debt, had been left standing. It wasn't a victory, but it was survival. The day of the Peterson farm auction was cold for April, with a raw wind that whipped across the bare fields and snapped the flags on the auctioneer's truck. The crowd was large, but the mood was that of a wake. These weren't hopeful buyers looking for a bargain. They were neighbors and friends, there to bear witness to the end of an era. They stood in small, quiet groups, their hands shoved deep in their pockets, their faces grim. Frank stood near the back, leaning against the fender of his old Ford, just as he had all those years ago. Dale's magnificent machines were lined up in a row, gleaming in the weak sunlight. The articulated 4366 tractor, the Gleaner N6 combine, the massive 24-foot disc. They looked like a display from a farm progress show, powerful and perfect. But to the assembled farmers, they were symbols of a fatal arrogance. They were too big, too complex, too expensive. The bids, when they came, were shockingly low. The men bidding weren't farmers, they were salvage dealers and equipment jockeys from out of state. Vultures picking over the bones. The 4366 tractor, which Dale had paid over $100,000 for, sold for $22,000. The Gleaner combine, its faulty electronic brain and known liability, went for less than $10,000. Frank watched Dale and his wife standing on the porch of their house. They looked small and lost, watching as their life was dismantled and hauled away, piece by painful piece. There was no gloating in Frank's heart, only a profound and weary sadness. He saw himself in Dale, saw how easily it could have been his own farm, his own life being sold to the lowest bidder. The last items to be sold were the parcels of land. The larger, newer tracts that Dale had bought during the boom years were snatched up by an out-of-state insurance company, a corporate entity with no connection to the community. Finally, the auctioneer pointed to the original 80 acres, the piece of land that held the house, the barns, the history of the Peterson family. "All right, folks," the auctioneer called out, his voice lacking its usual energy. "Here it is, the home place, a good house, solid barns. Who'll start the bidding at $50,000? Silence. The price was too high for any of the local farmers, all of whom were struggling to hold on to what they already had. The corporate buyer wasn't interested in a small parcel with a house on it. 40,000, the auctioneer pleaded. Do I hear 40? More silence. Frank saw Dale's wife turn away, burying her face in her husband's shoulder. This was the final indignity, that no one even wanted the heart of their farm. Frank felt a movement inside himself, a quiet decision that settled with the weight of stone. He had spent a lifetime avoiding debt, a lifetime of being careful. But this wasn't about profit or expansion. It was about something else. He took a step forward from the back of the crowd. 30,000, he said, his voice clear and steady in the cold air. Every head turned to look at him. Dale lifted his head, his eyes wide with disbelief. Mr. Henderson, the banker, who was there to oversee the proceedings, looked stunned. The auctioneer's eyes lit up. I have 30,000 from Frank Miller. Do I hear 35? 35. The corporate man shook his head. The other farmers remained silent. 30,000 once, 30,000 twice. The gavel came down with a sharp crack. Sold to Frank Miller. A quiet murmur went through the crowd, a ripple of surprise and respect. Frank didn't acknowledge them. He walked over to the auctioneer's clerk and wrote out a check from an account that had taken him 20 years of careful saving to build. Then he walked across the yard, past the stunned faces of his neighbors, and up the steps of the porch where Dale and his wife stood. He held out his hand, not to the auction papers, but to Dale. Dale, he said, his voice low, I don't want your home. Dale just stared at him, confused, his face a mask of shame and exhaustion. I'll rent it back to you, Frank continued. The house, the barns, and the 80 acres. You can farm it. The rent will be a third of the crop, same as any fair deal. It'll give you a chance to get back on your feet. No one should have to lose their home. Tears welled up in Dale Peterson's eyes. The man who had once mocked Frank, who had called him a relic, stood there speechless. He looked at Frank's outstretched hand, the hand of a man who understood the land not as a commodity, but as a home. Slowly, hesitantly, Dale reached out and shook it. Life settled into a new rhythm after that. The farm crisis didn't end overnight, but the worst of the storm had passed. Frank continued to farm his land and the 80 acres he now owned. Dale became his tenant, and over the years a quiet, unspoken friendship grew between them. The arrogance was gone from Dale, replaced by a hard-won humility. He started coming over to Frank's workshop, learning how to weld, how to rebuild a hydraulic pump, how to breathe life back into old iron. He learned the language of thrift and resilience that Frank had been speaking all along. The community's perception changed too. Frank Miller was no longer Old Man Miller, the man who was afraid of progress. He was the man who had survived, the man who had shown compassion when it mattered most. His wisdom, once seen as stubbornness, was now recognized as strength. He became an elder of the community, the one younger farmers came to for advice, not about interest rates or leveraging assets, but about how to set a plow correctly or how to time an old diesel engine by ear. Years later, in the early 90s, Frank's son, Tom, came home from agricultural college, his head full of new ideas about GPS guidance and variable rate technology. He found his father, now grey-haired but still strong, in the old machine shed. Frank wasn't working on the 4020. He was standing over the disassembled carburetor of his even older Farmall H, the little tractor he used for mowing and raking hay. Dad, Tom said, holding up a glossy brochure for a new planter with computer-controlled seed meters. Look at this. It can increase yields by 5%. We could finance it over 3 years. Frank picked up the carburetor bowl, squinting at the tiny jet inside. He blew through it gently, then held it up to the light of the single bare bulb. Let me show you something, he said, gesturing for his son to come closer. See this little passage? If it gets clogged with a piece of dirt, no bigger than a grain of sand, the whole engine will starve for fuel and quit. The tractor won't run. He handed the part to his son. You can buy the biggest, most expensive machine in the world. You can borrow $1 million to pay for it. But if you don't understand how this little piece of brass works, if you can't take it apart and clean it yourself on the side of a field, then you don't really own that machine. The bank owns it, the dealer owns it, and you're just the man in the seat, hoping nothing goes wrong. He took the part back and began to reassemble it with his gnarled, grease-stained fingers. The most important tool on this farm isn't in that toolbox, he said, nodding toward the big red chest in the corner. It's what you've got right here. He tapped his temple with a thoughtful finger. And the freedom you have right here. He placed his hand over his heart. The only way to keep that freedom is to owe no man anything. Tom looked from the glossy brochure in his hand to the simple, elegant piece of machinery his father was fixing. He watched the quiet confidence in his father's hands, the deep, settled peace in his eyes, and in that dusty, dimly lit machine shed, surrounded by the ghosts of old iron and the enduring scent of diesel and hard work, he finally understood. The legacy his father was passing down wasn't measured in acres or bushels, but in the quiet, unshakable power of a life that was truly his own.